free speech, which extends to offending religion, actually helps the idea of greater harmony within society. A lot of my rebuttals will be integrated into my substantives. But before I actually move on to that, I have really this one pressing issue which I want to address, right? Because he said that apparently when you have this sort of a policy where you can criticize religion, that A, it begets radicalism, and B, it creates a greater sense of it's essentially unfair to these religious groups because they don't have an avenue to voice themselves. On the first point, Mr. Speaker, in terms of begetting radical acts, we say firstly, that's a failure of law enforcement, and secondly, the burden on their side of the house is to prove that in the absence of restricting, or rather when you do restrict this freedom of this sort of freedom of speech, it's going to completely stop radical acts, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that's necessarily the case because we think that all these people who do engage in extremist acts have a list of 100 reasons to hate the West, but we think that this is just one more reason to give them, Mr. Speaker, so they need to prove on that side of the house that they can clearly end that. On the second level, we tell you that if their problem is that there is an unfair bias in terms of these people not getting enough avenues to be able to voice their opinions, then that's an argument to enable that free speech, Mr. Speaker, which we're very happy to stand for on this side of the house. We think that all these people should be given greater avenues to media houses, publications and whatnot. If the government wants to step in and give them greater number of newspapers or media houses, so be it. But that's not an argument to restrict free speech, Mr. Speaker. We think it's an argument to encourage free speech. Let's then move on to my substantives. Sit down, all of you. We tell you on the first level, we think offense necessarily is a bottomless pit. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? Because the moment you say that it's fine for you to get offended when I criticize religion, you cannot set a threshold on what exactly constitutes, that right to be offended. Which means you cannot really define whether it's fine for you to get offended on saying that we think that that burqa looks ugly, or whether you think that's bad enough, or whether you think it's bad enough to say that I'm going to burn the Quran, Mr. Speaker. There is absolutely no threshold. The moment you allow a certain level of offense to be permissible, we think it gives them an incentive to blow that up, Mr. Speaker, and say that any level of criticism is something that offends me, Mr. Speaker, because offense is something that is extremely subjective, something that they cannot define on their side of the house, Mr. Speaker. We think that's why on their side of the house, what they're really encouraging is a bottomless pit. What they're really encouraging is to let people get offended for the tiniest and for the smallest of things, Mr. Speaker, without really giving us a clear threshold, Mr. Speaker, for that. We think that's why on their side of the house, their principle is fundamentally harmful. But we tell you on the second level, no, please sit down. We think that their policy doesn't necessarily stand for the core identity of these individuals, but rather caters to mob culture. And this clashes directly with Joey's substantive of how religion is a core aspect of people's identity. And clearly he wasn't listening to Jayesh, Mr. Speaker, because we already talked to you about how the core aspect of an individual's identity that is something extremely subjective, Mr. Speaker. People could feel that they are extremely passionate about their political views, Mr. Speaker. People could feel extremely offended if you criticize the leaders of the political party that they believe in. People could feel extremely offended if you criticize the fact that they speak out in favor of animal rights. People could feel offended when you speak out against them when they stand in favor of world peace and against the war in Iraq, Mr. Speaker. We think all of these ideas can be a core aspect of a person's identity, Mr. Speaker. What then are they standing for, Mr. Speaker? They are standing for the banning of the banning of criticism of a certain form of identity which caters to the majority of society, Mr. Speaker. Because we agree that a large portion of society does view religion and does view race as being a core aspect of their identity, Mr. Speaker. But that does not mean that but that does not necessarily prove the fact that it shouldn't be criticized, Mr. Speaker, because that's not a set standard. There are so many other thousands and hundreds of thousands, probably even millions of individuals who have other aspects of their core identity, Mr. Speaker, which can be offended as well. An atheist might feel that it's a core aspect of his identity to be able to exercise that free speech to criticize other religions. But before I move on, Bhavya.
Yeah, so there's a word for when we pander to mob people when there is no apparent harm, as you've not shown. It's called democracy.
I don't really get the point, Mr. Speaker. You really are pandering to mob culture. You're saying that I am scared that a large portion of society is offended by religion, so I'm going to ban that form of criticism, but really a smaller portion of society is not offended, or rather cannot, galvanize that sort of movement where there can be tangible harm within society and cause large-scale destruction when you say, for example, criticize their passionate belief in animal rights. So no, I allow that form of criticism, Mr. Speaker. We think that is fundamentally bigoted, and that's why what you're really standing for is mob culture and not really standing for the idea of a person's core identity, Mr. Speaker. We think on this side of the house, we are standing for a person's core identity because we enable free speech across any and every sort of core identity, Mr. Speaker. If your identity or if a core aspect of your identity has been offended, we let you go out, rebut that, Mr. Speaker. We let you go out and speak out against it. We're giving you an equitable avenue to voice out your own opinions, Mr. Speaker. We think that's why we are fairer on our side of the house. Please sit down. Let's talk about the last idea, Mr. Speaker, which is why we think our policy allows greater harmony within society. Because in the status quo, we think that when you ban this sort of criticism of religion, what it leads is to simmering tensions, Mr. Speaker, because people really aren't sure of the views of the other individuals. What they only feed on is propaganda, which is very often, which is very often spread by media houses in a manner which is completely unrepresentative of views, Mr. Speaker. You think what happens when you enable this sort of free speech is to have a sort of free discussion of ideas, Mr. Speaker, and actually lets you come to that sort of equilibrium stage where people can decide which views are reasonable and which views are not reasonable, Mr. Speaker. Because clearly if people do come out and offend religion in a very grievous manner, then what can be done is for people to come out and speak out against it and show that how foolish they are, Mr. Speaker, as is the case with the Holocaust denial. In as many people as, in as much as people do try to come and deny it outright, we think there are more people who come out and say that, that's absolutely ridiculous, and that's why there's a larger sense of consciousness within society which tells people that that is completely ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. We think that's what creates harmony and ensures that there's no simmering tension and mistrust, Speaker, as compared to a scenario where they can visualize and perceive from themselves the extent of the level of hatred against them, which may not be necessarily true, Mr. Speaker. For all these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 19 seconds.
Yeah, you make fun of